Today in the EU, the Czech fossil fuel magnate with a passion for media. Despite being at the head of a fossil fuel empire at a time the Union is traversing a green transition, Daniel Kretinsky has managed to stay off the radar. That was until the Czech billionaire started acquiring media through Europe. Hello and welcome, I'm Giada Santana, and this is Who Pulls the Strings of the EU, a mini-series from the Today in the EU team where we dedicate each episode to individuals that shape the political landscape of the EU from behind the scenes.
Bonjour Daniel Kretinsky.
Daniel Kretinsky.
Daniel Kretinsky.
Daniel Kretinsky.
Daniel Kretinsky rarely gives interviews, and even in business negotiations, the Czech billionaire mostly prefers to lead talks without personally getting involved. Finance experts call him a Czech sphinx. As elusive as his profile is, analyzing Daniel Kretinsky is compelling, and so is the billionaire's interest in media. I'm in the studio with Théo Bourgery-Gonse, Euractiv's correspondent in Paris, to dig deeper into his influence. Théo, Daniel Kretinsky was born in the Czech Republic, and yet today we're virtually starting the conversation with you in Paris. What is the connection between the billionaire and France?
Right, so Kretinsky was born in the Czech Republic, and he's a Czech national. But his life story has brought him to France, first as a law student in Dijon in the east part of the country, and then as an investor in a number of business ventures. And in the past 6 years, he's invested in the media landscape, which he's most notorious for, but also retail and most importantly, coal power stations. And in that space of time, he's gone from being a relatively unknown figure in France to one of its most famous, if not infamous, investors.
Unlike other billionaires, Daniel Kretinsky was raised in a middle-class family and then managed to climb his way up to the top from where he leads the largest energy company in Central Europe. What's the story behind it?
In a nutshell, Kretinsky made a name for himself investing in sectors deemed ailing or underpriced, with a specific focus on polluting assets. So in 2009, he buys a set of coal power stations across Europe, claiming at the time that they are, I quote, the future of energy. And he does so through his EPH holding, which is now Czech Republic's largest company. And if you fast forward a few years, he invests in EU Stream or Ustream, a Slovakian gas pipeline transiting from Russia to Western Europe. And his passion for coal doesn't end there. In 2019, he invests yet again in 2 coal power stations in France, which were on the brink of closure. He's since then diversified his assets, but he's still known today as no less than the coal emperor.
At the same time, the Czech billionaire is attempting to diversify his portfolio. From energy to the publishing sector, Daniel Kretinsky's influence seems to be far-reaching. What are the key assets?
First and foremost, energy. It's coal, it's gas, but also some wind and solar farms that he owns. He's also an investor in a number of Czech and French publications. So he was a key investor in France's flagship daily Le Monde to journalist dismay until he sold back his shares in September 2023 to another French billionaire, the telco mogul Xavier Niel. He's also been increasingly investing in retail, becoming the largest shareholder in the Fnac Darty Group, which sells white and brown goods and consumer electronics, books, etc. And he's also a main shareholder in the German Metro Group. In March 2024, he's taken full control over the food retail chain Casino, and he's aired recently, as early as last week actually, that he was ready to take over Atos, a French IT behemoth, which incidentally EU Commissioner Thierry Breton used to run. And that company's been sailing in some rough financial waters recently.
Part of Kretinsky's strategy indeed seems to be to acquire companies that are in bad financial shape. Among those, there have been several media, a few of which in France.
Convaincu que la presse est absolument fondamentale aujourd'hui pour protéger les grandes valeurs de notre société.
I'm absolutely convinced the press is fundamental to protect the great values of our society, Kretinsky said in an interview. And yet, one of the magazines he owns in France, Marianne, protested the billionaire was actively influencing the editorial line of the magazine during the French presidential elections. In what way?
Sure. So Marianne is one of the French papers that Kretinsky owns. And Marianne journalists claimed that in April 2022, as presidential elections were underway, with Emmanuel Macron on the one hand and far-right Marine Le Pen on the other as the top two contenders, the journalist said that Kretinsky, the publication's main shareholder, intervened to change the front cover and lead story. So just to give you a quick sense of what the original version of the front cover looked like and what it was like after Kretinsky intervened. In the original version of the front cover, you had two faces, that of Macron and Le Pen, one atop the other, and there was a title that read Anger or Chaos. Anger was related to Macron, chaos to Marine Le Pen. In the new version, which journalists say Kretinsky had final say over, there stood the same layout, the same two faces, but with a different title, which read, In spite of anger, avoid chaos, which ultimately took a more active pro-Macron stance at a crucial time in French politics.
And yet, when we talk about France zooming in on the country, he's not the only billionaire that has moved into the business of acquiring large media companies.
You're right, it's an ever-growing concern, and traditional media players in the country have struggled to face competition from the internet and social media and have been badly in need of new cash flow sources. This has given billionaires the opportunity to sweep in and invest in ailing publications or TV channels or radio channels, with fears that some of these billionaires would ever so subtly influence editorial coverage. To give you just a few names of the billionaires that are involved in media ownership today. We've got Xavier Niel, who I mentioned earlier. He's at the helm of Le Monde. Bernard Arnault, who heads LVMH. He owns the country's leading economic newspaper, Les Echos, among several other titles. Vincent Bolloré, quite an infamous far-right figure, clear interventionist take on editorial coverage, veering towards a more right-wing news coverage. And in total, you've got 6 French billionaire or billionaire families that own close to 30 publications and media stations, including some of the biggest and most influential ones in the country.
About 6 months ago, concerns regarding Daniel Kretinsky were brought up to the European Parliament by one MEP, Mikolas Peksa. Mikolas, you've been in the European Parliament as a member of the Pirate Czech Party since 2019. What is the connection between politics and the fossil fuel industry within European institutions?
Well, I think there is a huge influence on the politics itself, because besides Daniel Kretinsky owning the fossil infrastructure, he has also huge influence in Czech media through the media group Czech News Center, where there are the biggest tabloids in the country, especially all the debates regarding the energy sector. But it expanded further on. As much as his business is to a large degree regulated by European legislation, the way how to influence the legislation is precisely through public campaigns in the media that are influencing the politics and subsequently the legislation. So there we see major interlinks between business and media and politics, and not only on Czech scale, but really on European.
How is Daniel Kretinsky perceived by politicians from the Czech Republic?
Well, Daniel Kretinsky is an oligarch. He is one of the 3 biggest players in Czech energy sector. And his company, EPH, has a major impact not only on Czech economy and policy, but on Europe as a whole.
What does it mean to be an oligarch in the context of a post-Soviet country?
Before 1989, there were no private companies in Czechia/Czechoslovakia. Everything was owned by the people, the state, let's say. You see Daniel Kretinsky, you see Andrej Babiš. They were theoretically, some 30 years ago, poor as any other citizens in Czechia. However, because of, let's say, the political connections, they were quite able to collect significant wealth. It's not only in Czech context, I mean, generally the whole Eastern Europe. And it's a legacy we are keeping from the previous times, and we will have to fight for some time into the future, because they are clearly not going to give up neither on the money nor the power that is connected to that.
How wealthy are we talking about?
If I compare simply personal wealth of Andrej Babiš, Daniel Kretinsky, or this sort of like Eastern European businessmen, there are more of them which are richer than Donald Trump. And yeah, Donald Trump inherited his personal wealth from parents and kind of like tried to expand it over his whole life. Whereas these people were, as said, before 1989, officially just normal citizens.
As a journalist, I think it's compelling that Kretinsky is following a line of billionaires that acquired media. He's not the first. He's most likely not going to be the last. How can the EU make sure that freedom of the press is protected from private interests?
I would say we really need a clear separation between the media and the companies that are active in this fossil fuel sector or energy sector in general, or companies which are involved in banking sector. They should not own the media at the same time, or they should not be connected, because these areas are strongly regulated, and basically then the media become tool to actually control the regulations, and this is problematic.
Overall, Kretinsky bought previously public companies that were subjected to environmental and legal constraints and added them to his privately owned portfolio. That means also under laxer controls. In a report to the European Parliament, you talked about it, particularly focusing on EPH's carbon emissions.
As said, EPH produces in total more emissions than, for example, the whole Finland. It is the 8th biggest owner of infrastructure for fossil gas. It has huge influence on the gas market, and they had extended cooperation with Gazprom, the Russian state-owned company. They are still active in the trading itself.
EPH has pushed back against your allegations, saying that their way of counting carbon emissions, that is by excluding companies EPH is a stakeholder of, only counting those for which EPH is a majority stakeholder, is perfectly legal.
Currently, I would say our system to monitor it is a bit outdated, and by simply the administrative tricks, they are quite able to report even lower emissions than they in fact produce, which still, even the lower reported number is quite big.
Was there any backlash to your political statement?
I can say so. I have been subject of attacks in various media owned by Kretinsky. One of the famous articles is the one when I'm being accused of intentionally diminishing Czech energy sector and trying to replace the Czech energy production with imports, which is certainly not my intention.
Do you think that the allegations against Kretinsky in France matter for the European Union and its common energy policy?
Daniel Kretinsky certainly learned his ways in Czechia, where the sensitivity among the journalists to political influences is way less compared to France. And he certainly tried his practices in France, kind of facing sort of like a resistance from the journalists who uphold their professional ethics. As much as Europe is currently interconnected and we have common European energy market, the influences of these oligarchs will propagate further on, because they certainly need to influence the regulations for the common energy markets. So for him, it is very much like a matter of life and death, or rather, let's say, further increasing of his profits or stagnation.
I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractivist Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. Leave us a star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This episode was produced by Miriam Sanz de Tejada, Nicoletta Yonta, and Giada Santana. See you on Friday. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.